This episode of the Better To podcast is brought to you by Kitty Mystic and Needom, author of the Better To Burnout series, which includes her latest releases of Fairy Tales and I Love You and Is Love Just Another High. Hey, Donna from the Better To podcast here. If you've listened to my show, you know that it always sounds great. That's thanks to the guys at Third Ear Audio Productions. Third Ear Audio helps podcasters, broadcasters, musicians, and business owners get their important messages out to their audience. Rich and the Third Ear Audio team are easy to work with. They're efficient and understand that your message is important to you. With quick turnaround and the true caring of your needs, Third Ear Audio is your go-to for any audio message. Reach out to Third Ear Audio at 312-388-5596. Rich and his team will deliver for you. That's 312-388-5596, or you could email them at info@thirdearaudio.com or visit them on the web at www.thirdearaudio.com. Welcome to the Better To podcast. I'm your host, Donna. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Amy Trueblood, and we do discuss her name, and yes, it is a real family name. It's not based on the TV show, but we do discuss that. So tune in. You might have heard my voice hosting the Better To podcast, but did you know I'm also the mastermind behind the Better To Burnout book series? The stories unravel the lives of Nigel Hartigan, the groovy bassist of Sambuca Fedora, the stunning singer-model Ava Richards, and the suave record executive singer Russell Langford. Love, romance, and drama run rampant as their lives tangle up. But brace yourself, folks, because not every tale has a happy ending. Snag your copy today from most online booksellers. Hi, Amy. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me today.
I'm good. So you write under two different pen names, mainly Amy Trueblood at the moment, correct?
Right. Yes.
And tell us a little bit about why you chose the name Trueblood, because as soon as I saw Trueblood, immediately, you know what I thought of.
Yeah. So Trueblood is a family name, so it's not something I was just sort of plucked out of the ether. It is a family name. And so I knew when I started writing that I sort of wanted to keep like my private, my writing life separately. So I knew I wanted to choose a name that I was familiar with, but had some family meaning, some emotional meaning, but that could also kind of just be my pen name. But I picked that before the show came out. So when I was on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, eons ago, I got lots of interesting tweets at me and a lot of interesting DMs when the show ever aired. So like I had to like mute myself like I think it was on Sunday nights. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And I think it's Charlaine Harris, right? Who wrote the books. I love her. I actually met her at a book convention once and told her my funny story, but I was very happy when the show was over with, because then I could like not have to worry about Sunday nights anymore. So it was very funny. So yes, very interesting. But yes, it is a real name and it is a family name.
I can imagine though. I mean, and some of them I'm sure were a little raunchy at times, I would guess.
Just crazy. Like people were mostly nice. I have to admit that people were mostly nice, but like a lot of people, even to this day are like, is that a real name? Is that your true name? You know what I mean? Like people don't really, think. I'm like, no, it's like a real last name, it's type of thing, but it's odd, but it's also cool too. Cause then like, it's so different that people have to remember you and remember your name. So it's good. It has good and bad parts to it. Definitely.
Everything does. I mean,
exactly.
My last name, when I really think about it, I have been Dawn Needom for a long time, or Donna Needom for a long time. And the fact of the matter is, Needom does not hyphenate well.
Oh, yeah. That's true. I never thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's either get rid of Needom or hyphenate it. And it doesn't hyphenate very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, last names, we don't think about it, but sometimes last names can be kind of tricky.
Yeah, very, very tricky. And, what's so funny is that when I decided, when I was talking to my agent and I was really shifting genres and shifting categories, she said, I think maybe you should think about, just sort of doing a separate name. But I was like, I don't like you spend all this time sort of building your platforms and building your social media and everything, I'm like, okay, what if we just did Amy True, which actually ended up working out great then because True works so great, like when you want to do a tagline. So now like my tagline now is like true heart, true love, true romance. So it actually played into it really nicely. But, at the time I was like, you work so hard to establish that name and people know you as that. So my hat's off to people who have like 4 or 5 different pen names that they work with, because I don't know how you do it, because I can barely keep track of what I got going on right now. So it's funny.
Well, and when you think about it, those taglines and the blurbs, those are the hardest things to come up with
Yeah.
because you can write how many, 100,000 words, 80,000 words, not a problem.
Yeah.
Then you got to condense it down to a tagline or a
Oh,
blurb. And
yes.
it's like suddenly the panic sets in and you have no place to go because it's like, where did all my inspiration go? It just went out the window. Because how do you take all that and just go,
Yeah. My biggest trick for that is I tell people even before, like when they're outlining or they're doing their synopsis or whatever, before they even write the book, is to like write a query for it first and then write like a hook line or something like that that stays true to kind of the story that you want to tell. And then you won't get so mired in all the other like sort of threads you have going on in your story. Because that was the hard thing for me, was after I had written Nothing But Sky, which was my first book under Amy Trueblood, I remember like my publisher and my publicist being like, oh, you need to come up with a tagline and all this kind of stuff. And my head was so filled with so much of what the story was about and the themes and all this kind of stuff that I had a really hard time sort of like boiling it down just to one line. So now I've learned my lesson. And now, like, before I write something, I always write the query, because that always tells me if I have a story or not, right? Because you have to have conflict, you have to have stakes. But then I also like to sort of like write like one little like tagline for it or something like that, so that again, I'm not so down in the, in the weeds so much with the story, that I can kind of have a clarity about what I want to say with the book. So, writing tip.
writing tips are always good, which
Yes.
really does bring me to, you have a journalism background. So how hard was it to switch from writing journalism
Well, it's
to
so
going to fiction?
Yeah, it's so funny because people ask me that, and it is like so different sides of like the sphere, right? You just like are like, journalism is all facts and no grandiose words. You're just there to kind of tell the story. So that's what I was trained as, and so when I first started writing fiction, my first drafts were super thin, like really thin, because I did not write in any detail. I just sort of wanted to get the story out of my head and on the paper. And then when I started working with critique partners and beta readers and stuff like that, they're like, you really need to like amp up the setting details, and you really need to amp up, the visceral cues in the book and all this kind of stuff. So it really took me time to sort of build my skill set to the point where like I could get out of the mindset of being a journalist and get into the mindset of being a fiction writer. And now it's like my drafts, my beginning drafts, what I like to call my zero drafts, are really thin. But now I sort of built up the skill set to be able to be like, okay, this setting needs to be just like large and huge, and I really need the reader to feel like they are sitting next to me in that scene or sitting next to the main character in that scene. But all of that just takes time and skill and just writing and writing and writing, because at first it was really difficult for me and it took me a while to sort of build that skill set.
Well, and it's kind of funny when you think about it now because we had storms here last night, and the way, I mean, I'm in my 50s. So the way the media has changed dynamics over
Oh,
time. I
definitely.
mean, it used to be, we're going to have a snowstorm. We'll have some snow, or we're going to have rain, and maybe
Yeah.
we'll have some flooding. Now it's
Yeah.
like Snowmageddon. Where did that come from?
Well, everything now is like having a headline, like a clickbaity headline, right?
Mm-hmm.
Type of thing. And even, it's crazy because I don't want to get too much into this, but like I had like a big part of my degree was ethics. And like I had 2 different types of ethics teachers and ethics courses that I had to go through. And like what ethical things you are beholden to as a journalist, and being true to sources and all this kind of stuff. And so it's interesting to see sort of how that has evolved sort of over the years, and changed a little bit. So now it's like when I watch a show, I'm like, oh Lord. When I watch like a newscast, I'm like, oh, it's
Yeah.
hard to sort of get out of the journalistic mindset of what you were trained and sort of see. But news has also sort of become entertainment now, so it's a totally, like, I would never be able to live in that world now, just because it's so much more about like being a personality and being entertainment than it really was like when Walter Cronkite and those
Oh yeah.
types were, Dan Rather were, very serious about being newsmen.
Yeah, now it's infotainment. We have to entertain, and I think that's
Yeah.
because we are constantly, with the evolution of cable and social media, we are
Yeah.
constantly wanting something to entertain us.
Yeah, yeah. I remember, I'm gonna age myself, but I like remember when CNN was like a new thing, you know what I mean? And I'm like, wow, this
Hmm.
is crazy. Like news 24/7, because really the only time you could get your news was from your morning newspaper, an evening newspaper when those were actually delivered, or from like the three major networks, right? And then
Hmm.
with the advent of CNN and then all the other cable channels, it sort of really changed the landscape of news reporting as a whole.
Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember when the Weather Channel was just a little scroll for the most
Yeah,
part in your radar, and then yeah,
true.
so
Yeah,
I
true.
understand. I know exactly where you're at.
Yep, yep,
Totally.
yep.
So, what inspired you to become a fiction writer?
So I had always, this is a funny thing when I go to conventions and stuff like that and I sit on panels, I'm always the odd man out because everybody's like, "Oh, I've been writing since I was, in first grade," or, "I've been writing fan fiction since I was 12," or whatever. And I had always been like a writer. I'd always journaled, but had never really thought about the idea of writing fiction and writing books and stuff like that. And after I became a journalist and all this kind of stuff, I started thinking about, I had worked for a long, I worked in entertainment, and then I worked in advertising, and I did copywriting and all this kind of stuff. And I sort of just knew that I loved words. I knew that was what I wanted to do. And so as my life sort of evolved and my career evolved, I started getting this idea, well, maybe I just want to like try it. Let me just like give it a shot. So I gave myself like a year. I had a big birthday coming up. And so the year before the big birthday, I'm like, my gift to myself is just to challenge myself to see if I can write a book. And so I just had this idea, and I just at night, or whenever I had free times on the weekends, I just kind of like, bought it. And, literally story will never see the light of day. It's like, I made all the rookie mistakes and everything. But you know what? I'm always encouraging people to do that because that's how you learn, right? You
Mhm.
gotta dip your toe in the water and you gotta learn. And I just got bitten by the bug. Like as soon as that book was done, I was like, okay, what's the next idea? What do I want to do next? And I'm a real big advocate of not only understanding the craft of writing, but understanding the business of publishing. So after I finished my first book, I did like a deep dive and just tried to learn what querying meant, what writing a synopsis meant. Studying how agencies work, what it meant to have an agent, what it meant to have a publishing contract. I just really got down deep into it and did, the business and understanding of how the process worked. And that really helped because when I was to a point where I could write a book after I'd, had friends look at it and had really massaged and polished it, I thought, okay, now I understand how the business of this works. So I can put my knowledge to work and sort of query and stuff like that. And even then, having knowledge and having worked on several books before that, I was in the query trenches a long time. I think I queried like my third book that I had actually queried with was the one that got me my agent. So it just is a lot about learning the business, but also just like perseverance. You just, and now, I mean, this was like 10 years ago. So now it's even harder out there in the trenches, and there's fewer agents and there's fewer imprints. And so it's a super big challenge now. But I wouldn't change it for the world. I've loved my whole journey. So it's been really good.
So, what inspired Meet Me in Ivy Falls?
So I love to call Ivy Falls my like palate cleanser book. So I spent years and years writing historical fiction, young adult historical fiction, and hours and hours inside research books and trying to find sources and looking at old videos for not only Nothing But Sky, but for my second book, Across a Broken Shore, which is 1930 San Francisco. So I spent years just doing research, and I just was like, I just want to write a book where I don't have to stop every 10 seconds and look to see if something's going to be factually accurate. And so I was, it was right in that, that time in like 2020 when everybody was at home, and I was like watching a lot of HGTV, and I was just sitting down one day and this show came on, and I was like, there's a story idea here. Like, I'm always like a what if person. And so the kind of the idea of like a small town, and the small town sort of like struggling, and somebody in the town wanting to save the town's history. And that sort of just rolled out into Meet Me in Ivy Falls. And I am somebody who sometimes has to write a while before I find a character's voice. And the main character in Meet Me in Ivy Falls, Torn, like, she just came to me right away. And just as soon as I started writing her, her voice came to me right away. And when I originally wrote the book, I think I started writing the book in like 2015. It was told in third person. And then as the love interest Beck came on the page, I just like sort of fell in love with him. And I was like, oh no, I'm like, this book has to be dual POV because I want readers to hear his views and have his thing. So I wrote the entire book in third person. And then it took me months to go back and totally rewrite the book in dual POV. And it was the best choice I ever made, because it just, for readers, especially for romance readers, I just feel like that sometimes hits the sweet spot, because it's great to have, the an omniscient narrator and all that kind of stuff. But I think with romance, people love to get inside people's heads and know what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And so sort of taking that time to move it from third person to dual POV past, it was the best choice I ever made. It was a lot of work, but it just felt right for the story. So yeah, so just for me, and then as I was writing other books, I just kept coming back to the Ivy Falls book. It just, like, every time I had a break or I was in between edits or something like that, it's just the book that made me happy. And so I really never thought that it would sell. It was more of just like the book I went to when I needed to go to my happy place. And then as I was working with my agent, she asked about it. And so I sent it to her, and she read it in a weekend, and she was like, oh, this is your next book. So it sort of was one of those things where I wasn't really ever expecting it to have like public consumption. It was my like own little like secret project. And so now my secret project is going to be everybody else's read now. So, which is kind of a nice thing, because I really do love the story.
But that's the thing. If you put your heart into it, the readers are going to recognize that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, and this book has just gone through like so many changes, and I really had to dig deep for both characters, because both characters are very complex, and it's, every book is like a teaching tool, and this book just made me dig deep, sometimes deeper than my historical books have made me do. So I'm really grateful for that, and it's a series. So the nice thing is that these characters that I've created now, I still get to live with them for a little while. Like, they won't be the main characters, but they'll still make appearances. So I'll still kind of get to hold on to them for a while, which is fun too.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you had talked about conventions. I have not been to a convention at this point. I did go to a television producers convention, but I've not been to an readers author convention.
Yeah.
And I know recently, did you happen to go to a convention in Denver this past year or this year?
I did not. I've heard all the stories about it, but I did not go. No.
But typically for you, the convention has been a positive thing. It has not been something that has been mired in controversy like this last one.
Gosh, no. For me, one of the greatest things about conventions is meeting readers. And I've been to the Texas Library Association. I've been to the American Library Association. And then I've done like some smaller local conventions. And we actually have a really great like comic book convention locally in Phoenix. It started out as a Comic Con, but then the Comic Con sort of copyrighted the name, so everybody sort of had to change their name. So now it's called Phoenix Fan Fusion. And I did that last May. And it was literally like the most magical 3 days of my life. I did panels with like some of like my heroes and got to sit next to like people and talk to readers. And it was the most magical experience. So book conventions are just like catnip for me because I just love meeting people and talking about books. And a lot of the sessions I did and a lot of the panels I did were really like writing craft focused. So it was really nice to be able to kind of talk about writing craft. But then also after the panels were over, like people were encouraged to come up and talk to the authors like individually. So I had a lot of great questions and met a lot of great people. So it was a really, really positive experience. I've only ever had positive experiences at book conventions.
I find it funny when we talk about historical fiction because I think it was when we hit 2020, the 80s became historical fiction.
Oh gosh. Oh,
No,
I
I
know.
know this is the reaction I always get because I write, my books are written set in the 80s,
Yeah.
mainly 80s and 90s. And when every
Yeah.
time I mention that this is now historical fiction, they look at me like, no, there's no way. And I'm like, yeah, actually, technically it is.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that blows people's minds. Like somebody was talking the other day about a book that they were reading about 9/11. And somebody was saying, I was so freaked out because like it had a historical sticker on it. And I'm like, yeah, like it's crazy, but like that's where we're at now. Like it's really, really wild to think about that now. Somebody said the other day that like the 80s are like almost like 50 years ago or something like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't even think about that. It doesn't seem possible, but I think the 80s and 90s were such a fun period of time to live in. And I think it's awesome that you've set books in those times because I talk about just a time of joy and a time of revelry, and the fashion and the music and everything in that time period was just fantastic.
Well, and because mine are set in the Hollywood realm, it's like the paparazzi was different. You didn't have the
Oh,
option for cell phones. Yet,
oh yeah.
so everything you have to take a lot of things that we knew out
Yeah.
or know and take that out. Somebody
Yeah.
actually the other day, somebody actually said something about Gen Z is saying, so what was it like to live in the late 1900s, about the 90s? And it's like, oh,
Oh Lord, I've never heard it phrased that way, but
I
now I'm
know.
terrified.
I know. It's like, wait, no, you're making me older than I am. I
Oh
mean,
gosh. Yeah.
it's kind of wild when you think about that. The younger generation is just viewing it as so much different. And we're still going, hey, it was only 20. Oh, no, it wasn't.
Yeah. A lot of the people like in Gen X, you know what I mean? It's just so
Mm-hmm.
funny. Like on certain social media platforms, I see people who are like very into Gen X, and they're like, we were the cool kids who still like, our parents could dismiss us on a Saturday morning during the summer and say, go have fun with your friends, come back when the street lights go on, you know what I mean, type of
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
We would that would be unheard of now, you know what I mean? So I heard somebody say like the other day it was the last great childhood generation kind of thing, and I totally feel that way. You know what I mean? It was
Oh,
it
yeah.
and just in the time of just like history and culture and everything like that. You look back on it now, and there's just so many fun, cool things about it. So I think that's awesome, though, that you get to kind of live in that world because that's such a fun time and period in history. I just love
And I
it.
mean, we don't have that joy. And it's like, that's why I kind of want to go back and write about it because we have
Yeah.
that joy. But in the same breath, there's certain things that have happened in that time that was historically relevant that
Oh
put
yeah.
us on the trajectory we are now. So it's kind
Thing.
of interesting to play. And that's why it's like the way I've written, I've jumped around time wise. So I've
Yeah.
written in the 80s and the 90s, and I have to hold myself accountable because two of my books are set in the 90s, and I went
Mm,
back and started writing in the 80s. So I have to bring
yeah.
them. I have a certain point here where they have to get to.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting because writing historical is like such a different realm because my first book took place in 1922, my second book took place in 1930, and there are so many gender conventions and things like that that people think about and all this kind of stuff. But what I think is always such a challenge, because both my books, I mean, my brand sort of is writing like white historicals. I love to write about women in history you don't know about, but you should. That's kind of my thing. And then my newest book that I just finished is adult historical. It kind of has that same brand to it. And what is always so interesting to me is once you do your research, you always find that there are people there were always women who were pushing boundaries and doing things that weren't, in the convention of what was considered, like the female role at the time or whatever. And it's just so funny because the number of people who then read your book and sort of push back a little bit, you know what I mean? And you're like, no, you have to understand that like not everybody, just like now, nobody back then just perfectly fit into a box. Like there were still trailblazers and, women who did not want to have the traditional wife and mother role and were chasing their dreams and all this kind of stuff. So it is kind of nice sometimes to be able to sort of bring people into the real world of, even though it was 100 years ago or whatever it was, people were still, chasing their dreams and just figuring out who they were as humans, you know what I mean? And so that's what I love about writing historical sometimes, is sort of pushing against those expectations and also kind of writing the ship too, because I think a lot of people think that they've read so much about that time in history that they know, but a lot of times the things that they've read in history have been retold so many times that they're not facts.
Get a telephone. Sorry.
Yeah. And it's that. But like, I remember when I wrote Nothing But Sky, somebody made a comment in one of my reviews about the length of the main character Grace's dress. And, and how, flappers, dress like hemlines were in it. And I was like, I don't ever reply to reviews. Reviews are for readers and all this kind of stuff. But what I thought was, I don't blame them so much because the 1920s, everybody thinks about the 1920s and they immediately Gadsby and all this kind of stuff. But hemlines, did not raise until 1927, 1928. You know what I mean? That was really the heyday of like the flappers. But when anybody talks about the Roaring '20s, everybody just thinks it covers that entire decade and that everybody dressed that way. And that was sort of the way of life was. So, it's writing historical too. You're sort of like trying to, again, change those thoughts and opinions about history that have been told to you that maybe aren't real, and also trying to teach people something and try to broaden their world as far as the aspect of what life was really like back then, and that sometimes people didn't always follow the traditional roles.
I get that completely, because my editor was younger than I, and she said to me, because I had written in there about a Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And she's like, well, why can't you just say Volkswagen convertible? I'm like, well, because there's like 7 of them.
Yeah.
And I want to connect with that reader that may be my age that's going to go, wait, like you did. I know that car.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
And so just like you're trying to, so like you, I go through, I have people laugh because I have tour books from like 1984 and 85 of certain cities that I'm writing about. And they're like, well, you can get that on the internet. Not if it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, it's not there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you get your research, and yours is even further back than mine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because in my second book, Across a Broken Shore, the young woman in it wants to be a doctor. And so she's apprenticing with another female doctor who lives in her neighborhood. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I've just written myself into a corner, because now I'm going to have to figure out what the practical applications for medicine were in the early, 1935, 1936 time. And so I tried to do a bunch of research, and I thought, no, I'm going to need like primary sources on this. So I spent like a couple of months like hunting Etsy and hunting eBay for early medical textbooks, like 1930s medical textbooks. I actually found 2 Red Cross like medical textbooks from the early 30s. And so a lot of the stuff that actually is in the book is taken actually from how like you would tourniquet an arm or how you would take care of a burn, how they would actually do it in the 1930s, even down to like what sort of thread they used for surgical stitches and stuff like that. I had to like get deep down in the weeds with it, because I was like, how you practice medicine now obviously is not how they would have practiced medicine in the 30s. So I was like, if I'm going to go there, I got a lot more work to do and a lot more research to do, because I have to make it realistic for that time period. So so historical's fun, but you also tend to get yourself in corners and write yourself into corners when you give your characters these really wild sort of job occupations or whatever, and then you're like, okay, now I'm going to have to figure out how all that works, well, so it's interesting.
Even it's something as simple as this. So it's 1984, my character's pregnant. Well, there's 2 options. She could go get the chemistry kit, and do that or go to the doctor. That's the
Right.
only options. It wasn't the pee on the stick thing. And that's
Right.
what people don't realize, that it used to be this whole complicated thing.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to look at, exactly like you said, you have to go back and really dig in the weeds and go,
Yeah.
okay, I need to, this point here, it has to be authentic. Because while most readers are not going to be that detailed oriented, there's
Yeah.
going to be a few that are going to call you out if you don't have it, like the hymn.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's
Yeah.
best
Yeah.
to make sure that you have your bases covered.
Yeah, and I think the thing though too, to be fair, is a lot of times when you're writing historical fiction, a lot of times you can't find that information or you sort of have to play with that information. And I always am telling people, especially people who struggle with, they want to write historical, but they're worried about like having everything be super factual. And I say, first, you got to remember it's fiction. Second of all, you're not always going to be able to have a primary source on something. You need to keep it as period accurate as possible. But you also need to share with the reader, like in your author's note, hey, in order to move the story along, I had to do X, Y, and Z, or, something like that. In my second book, like I had to have it was, right at the end of the Depression. So I had to have like a sort of like a shantytown type of setting for a part of the book, for a thread of the book. And of course, I didn't have one in San Francisco. So I sort of had to create one. And in a very specific part of a town near Baker Beach where you can actually see the outline of the Golden Gate Bridge and all this kind of stuff. So I actually went there, I visited, I tried to figure out where this would be. And then I just said in my author's note, hey, this I needed this for the story. This is where I created it. It's a real place, but the shantytown was of my own creation, that type of thing. And I think readers appreciate the fact that you're trying to stay as historically accurate as possible, but sometimes for convention of story, you just can't always, be so extremely literal with things, and I think, even myself as somebody who reads historical widely, I really appreciate when the author will say, hey, I did X, Y, and Z because I needed to move the narrative along, but it may not be traditionally historically accurate. So
Yes, well, this brings up a great topic because
yeah.
yesterday I watched the Iron Claw. I did not watch. All right, to be fair, I'm not a big wrestling fan.
Okay.
My mother drugged me to go see wrestling matches because my grandmother loved wrestling matches. So I turned it on and I ended up knowing the Von Erich people. I knew them.
Yeah.
So I watched the whole movie, fine. But the reason why I bring this up is because they omitted so many things. Because I went back and I was like, wait, I didn't realize this. They changed the timeline. They omitted certain things, even though you're dealing with a real group of people.
Yeah.
They took out because there was other deaths that they didn't include in there. And the director was like, because of the fact that we already had so many numbers of deaths, we didn't want to keep bringing that in.
Right. Right.
So here's something that's a reality based, but
Yeah.
you had to still change it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think in the end, you know what I mean? Like you have to think about what serves the story, right? And what the read what's going to pull the reader along. And sometimes for plotting or pacing reasons, you can't always, do everything, A to Z as far as historically is considered. But, I think also too, you have to give a nod to the fact that, one, you're again, like you're writing fiction, but second of all, that, you're doing your best to give the most authentic experience to the reader. But, in order to do that, sometimes you have to dance around the details.
Mm-hmm. So it's a fine line between being detailed and then being too detailed and not moving the story because you're so. And that's the thing. I want to go to Anne Rice for a second because I loved Interview with the Vampire. I thought it was a great book. I liked the second book. By the time I got to the third book, and she's very detail oriented, it was just kind of like, I can't read this. It's too much. It just got bogged down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so hard, right? Because I always have this sort of thing I listened to a great speaker once at a writing conference, and they were like, there's telling yourself the story and then there's telling the reader the story. And often when you're telling yourself the story, you've got all these extraneous details, right? Like my thing used to be that I used to get in big trouble as I loved to like setting as a character as a thing for me. So I love to like get down into the dirty nitty gritty details about setting. And then eventually my first agent was like splashing, you know what I mean? She's like, okay, I love that you want to be, this detailed and you want to take your reader there, but we don't need to know about the setting for 3 paragraphs. You know what I mean? And so it's this kind of thing where you have to get out of your head of like, writing the story for you versus writing the story for the reader. And that's why I'm always telling people about like why writing the book is so important, but revising the book and editing the book is actually an even bigger part of, being a writer, is because you have to sort of think about what is serving for the story the best and what is going to keep your reader turning the pages. And if you're so bogged down in specific historical details or vampire lore or whatever it may be. If I'm correct, it took place in New Orleans, right?
Yes. Yes.
Interview with a Vampire. Yeah. So
Yes.
I remember like reading Interview with a Vampire, and I think was the second one Lestat?
Lestat was the second one. When we got to the Queen of the Damned, that's when we started just getting...
Yeah, and so you get so into, but if you're somebody who's loved that, you already know the setting, you already know the details, you know what I mean? You may need to, nod your head to it a little bit, but you really want more of the story, like where is that story going, But as writers, we sometimes, we overwrite and then we have to pull it back. So it's hard.
Did you see the movie Wonder Boys with Michael Douglas? There's a great example in that movie of overwriting. Yeah. So he's a professor. He has a drinking problem and a substance problem, but he's working on this book. His agent is after him to publish his book. He's got boxes, and I'm talking boxes of his manuscript. Yes. And so he hands it to one of his students to read it, and she's like, I appreciate all the work you did, but did we need to know the whole heritage of the lineage of every horse and every horse's prior breed?
That's great. Yeah.
And then ultimately what happens is the agent borrows the book. There's a whole mishap and the book gets lost. All his manuscript blows away in the wind.
Oh no.
But he ends up writing a better book because he was overwriting. He was under the influence. And so it's a good lesson about overwriting, that sometimes we think we need every little detail. And the reader wouldn't even care.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think about that a lot when I'm like working with new writers, you know what I mean? And they're like, they're blocking a scene and they're moving like one character from one place to another. And I'm always telling them, like, you have to remember that the reader is smart. So you don't have to actually tell the reader that when the car stops, they put the car in park and then they take off the seatbelt. You know what I mean? Like, all of that is, extraneous stuff. You know what I mean? If you say the character parks the car and then he walks to the front door, you know what I mean? The reader infers that he's had to take off. You know what I mean? It's this type of thing. And that really comes with like, years and years of learning craft and learning writing and all that kind of stuff. And so I just feel like, when you first start out, you feel like you have to tell all those things. You have to share all those things. And then I think as your skill set gets better and you work with better writer friends and better critique partners, you sort of learn that a lot of that like superfluous stuff isn't necessary. Back to what we were talking about serving, the story and the narrative and pushing it along. Because there's for me, like the worst thing that somebody can say is like, oh, the story was so slow. Like, I'm like, oh, then I got work to do because I don't want you to call, I want my story to move. I want you to keep turning the page. So I think I'm always thinking that in the back of my head is how can I keep the story moving?
I think that's the biggest compliment you can get as a writer is to have a review that basically states, I have one of those that actually says, I plan on making dinner. And I was just going to read for a little bit and then I was going to make dinner and then I get back to it. And before I knew it, the kids were coming home from school and I was almost through the book. I was like, oh, okay. That's when that's the true moment that you go, okay, I did my job as a writer.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's a skill set that I don't think that comes to anybody naturally. I think that's a skill set that absolutely has to be learned.
Yeah. And also the other thing I think is connecting with the reader emotionally. I have one story where I've been told that this man is the vilest man in the world. Okay, fine. But here's the thing. Even though he's vile, you still connect with him. He still makes you angry.
Yes.
So therefore, I did my job. It doesn't mean,
Yeah, I have a sticker on my laptop here that says, bad choices make good stories. And I'm always telling, like when I'm working with younger writers, I'm always telling them, you have to let your characters make bad choices. You have to force your characters to make the wrong choice, the wrong decision. You know what I mean? Because without stakes, without conflict, you don't have story. And the greater you can make the character human on the page, the more that your reader is going to fall in love with that character because they're flawed just like they are. They see character traits in that character that they may see in themselves. So in order to get the reader to connect, you have to make your character incredibly flawed. And without flaws, you don't have character arc, right? Because if you're starting in the old world and you're moving to character to the new world, they've got to have these ups and down experiences, and they've got to go down several wrong paths before they get to whatever the end of the hero's journey is going to be, right? And so I'm always telling, character somebody like when they're struggling like the end of the scene or something like that, I'm always like, okay, write on a piece of paper like 3 choices that character can make and make them all really bad choices. And then whichever one speaks to you that you think you can use that's going to move the story forward and that's going to help that character grow, use that one. And then just write it out and see if it works. Because I always feel like, the stories I get bored with are when the characters are almost too perfect. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like they don't seem realistic. Like I'm always like so funny, but I'm always like rooting for like a character to like just pick the wrong guy or make the wrong choice, or you know what I mean? Like, pick the job that wasn't right for you, type of thing, just because that's where your story is. That's where your character's going to grow. And so I love that, bad choices make good stories, because I feel like that's where you get to the nitty gritty and the heart of a character's if you let them go down the wrong road for a period of time, and then they have to learn and grow from it.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, when I used to write in high school with my friends, most of them had these just perfect little relationships. And here I am writing drama. And it's not that my life was that way. It was just, I'm writing drama because that's going to give you a story.
Right.
And one of the things, back to that vile man, I was told by one reviewer, there's no way you're ever going to redeem this guy.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. Well, I'm back to doing a time jump from 1997 to 1984. And guess what? It's easy to redeem him that way because now he's a young man.
Well, his backstory, how he got there. Like, I'm always fascinated by, there is a book series by Tahira Mafi called Shatter Me. It's a YA book series. And there's a character in that is the villain in it. He's like the most, again, vile person ever. And I was like, there's no way she's ever going to be able to redeem this guy. There's no way. And like by book 3, he's like totally redeemed. And I'm like, that was like masterful storytelling, how she brought you along, because at the end of the first book, you hate him. Like you want the main female character to like just like put a dagger in him and be done with him. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then by like the book 3, you're totally like, your brain and your brain chemistry is totally changed about this person, and that's masterful. That's a master. Yeah. If somebody can bring you along as the reader and take you from here to super dark to super light with that character, and that's just, I remember telling somebody, if they're worried that they cannot redeem a character, I'm like, go back and read that book. Go read that book. Go read that series. Watch how she just, from point A to point Z, takes small little pieces of narrative and small little pieces of him revealing himself. And it's just great. So if you can do that, I mean, you were just, it's A+ in my book, because I think that's probably one of the hardest things to do.
What shocked me was when I gave the next book out to my ARC readers, and they're coming back saying Team Nigel all the way. And I'm just like, this was the man that was the vilest human being in the world by some of you. And you're like, yeah.
Yes.
Like,
yeah. Look at you, did your job. Like that's exactly. Like the best thing ever. I remember one of the first reviews that came back for Nothing But Sky. And there was like sort of a twist at the end in the book. And I rewrote that twist a dozen times. And every time I wrote it, I was like, people are going to figure it out. It's not going to be a twist. It's not going to work. Nobody's going to believe it, or people are going to guess it. And then I gave it to my mom, who is like the queen of reading mysteries. And, I can't go to the movies with her because she like will tell me who the villain is in like the first 10 minutes and all this kind of, and unfortunately I've become that way too. So now my children, every time I go to like the movies with my children, they're like, shh, don't ruin it. Yeah. But the point is that if you plot right and you plan it right and you lay the groundwork right, and it works, but it takes work to get there. You know what I mean? It takes
Yeah.
a lot of work to try to make it happen and make the reader believe it. You know what I mean? And one of the best compliments I ever got was when the twist came back. I got a compliment in a review that said I had to go back from the beginning and read the book over again to notice all the places where you
Nice.
dropped all the hints and all the breadcrumbs. And I was like, yes,
Nice.
because I was so worried that, you know what I mean, that it wasn't going to have a payoff, like that people were going to notice too soon what I was alluding to or who I was pointing the finger at, So it always feels like a little bit of a gold star when you can pull the reader along like that. Much to your point of being able to have a character who's super dark, and by the end of the book, everybody's cheering for him. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just fantastic.
Well, and I mean, what you were saying about, yeah, being a writer, and I don't know if it's also because I worked in insurance, but being a writer, and it's bad to watch TV in the movies sometimes because most times you're able to sit there, like you said, first 10 minutes in, you're like, okay, yeah, that's the killer. And my husband will look at me and go, how do you know this? And I'm like, because, and 9 times out of 10, I'm right. And when they surprise me, that's when I'm like, okay, you did your job. You
Yeah.
did your job. Because
Yes.
most of the time it's just like, okay, this is how this is going to play. And when it doesn't,
Yeah.
then I'm really impressed.
I can count on like one hand the number of movies that I've seen that like totally like at the end I was like, whoa, like I did not see that coming. And I'm always like recommending those movies to people who are like the people who are like, oh, I totally know who did it. I totally know what's happening. I totally know who the bad guy is, because the twist has been done so well that like even me who like looks for every single little clue didn't catch it. So my hat's off to storytellers who can do that and can surprise me, because it's hard to surprise me
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I can name some movies from the 90s like The Game, Fallen. Wild Things had a twist to it. There's certain movies that just made you think. And that's, I guess, what I prefer too. I want a movie that's going to make me think. While I like
Yeah,
to check my mind at the door occasionally, I
yeah,
do like a good movie that's going to make me think.
yeah. The one I always quote is The Others with Nicole Kidman.
Yes, that's a good one too. Yeah.
That was like, whoa, I did not see that coming. And then the other one was No Way Out with Kevin Costner, which is a total 80s movie.
Hmm.
But that one too, the ending to that one, I was like, what is happening? Like, I was like, I did not see that coming either. So those are the two I always tell people, like, if you really want to like be shocked, watch those movies. Like the plotting and the pacing and how the story is told in both those movies is pretty brilliant.
But the biggest unknown factor that people talked about in the early 90s was The Crying Game. Everybody talked about the twist of the
Yeah,
big,
yeah. I mean, that was
and everybody
groundbreaking.
and everybody
Totally
kept it
groundbreaking.
secret. That was the other thing. Most people kept it secret. It would not have survived on social media today.
Oh gosh, no. I
But
would say the
back
same
then,
thing about The Sixth Sense, though, too.
yeah, yeah,
I mean,
everybody kept that one too.
well, yeah, I thought everybody was really like, I remember that was when I guessed. So, but I remember like being places and like hearing people talk like at restaurants, because at that time, that was the first M. Night Shyamalan movie, and everybody was like, loving it and all this kind of stuff. And I remember people at other tables, like looking at other people and being, don't say anything, don't spoil it for them. You know what I mean? Let them go experience it. So even people knew that there was a spoiler, they just didn't know what the spoiler was. And I always thought that was so great that people sort of like kept it to themselves so that other people could enjoy it.
But nowadays, social media, they spoil things all the time.
No, no. If there's a specific show or something that I want to watch, like I remember I was getting ready to watch Bridgerton, the season 3 when it came out, and I like totally avoided all social media because I knew everybody was going to start posting pictures and they were going to start, posting screen caps and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't want to be ruined. I want to totally go into it. Obviously, I'd read the book, but I wanted to go into it and see what their adaptation was going to be like. So, like, I avoided the internet because I was like, I know somebody's going to spoil it for me.
Well, and that's the thing. Even though you're reading the book, it's going to be different. Most
Yeah.
books and movies do not line up.
Yeah. No, no, no. But I'm always like clever adaptations. Like
Hmm.
the the screenwriter, hopefully in conjunction with the actual author, their sort of clever way of bringing it to the screen. I'm here for that. You know what I mean? Because you just you can't do a full adaptation unless you have 5 hours, and nobody's going to sit through a 5 hour movie. So I like that, there are clever ways to do adaptations if it's done right. And usually that's if the author's on board.
Well, there was the Netflix series called Sex Life that was based on 40 different men or something. Like, I don't remember the title, so forgive me. Okay. But I had a friend who loved the book. Yeah. And then she watched the series and she's like, it's nothing like it. It was supposed to be this whole lark of her having 40 different men or 4 different men and having their stories that she's had these great wild sex with these men. And yet that's not how it played out. Yeah. It was all fiction, but it wasn't the way the TV show played out.
Yeah, and that's hard too, right? Because if you're really a devotee of the books, it's hard when the adaptation doesn't work.
Well, and they're changing up even the new adaptation for the Interview with the Vampire series. They've skewed the books a little. And I watched the first season. I thought it was good. I didn't mind the movie, the Interview with the Vampire movie. The Queen of the Damned, well, that was once again. Yeah. But I mean, those are different things. And as a writer, I mean, I'm sure you aspire to have a screenplay and have your books transferred to movie or television. Sure. And have you thought about reaching out to Passion Flicks?
No.
Because that's what they do. Passion Flicks is all about the romance book becoming a movie.
Really? That's fascinating. I'm going to have to look into them. That's the first time I've ever heard that.
Yes. It's a subscriber thing that I don't watch it, but I know that some of the authors that I have followed, they have projects in the works with them.
Very cool. All right. I'm going to have to definitely check that out. Yeah, I did not know about that resource, so I'm definitely going to have to look into that. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing.
I have a lot of friends who write, sweet closed door romance, and they're always trying to pitch stuff and write stuff for like Hallmark and stuff like that. So I know that there's definitely, passion out there for it, type of thing. So yeah, I'm going to look into that. Thank you. That's great.
I laugh at the library here where I live. I live in a small town in Illinois, and there is actually, because it's a small town, there actually is a section that says clean romance.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've never seen that anywhere else, but in this library.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the whole other thing that everybody wants, smut. So it all...
Yeah. That's the thing about being new to the romance community is I don't like a lot of the, sort of policing terms. I'm just going to say, to try to be, kind about it. But I just feel like you should you should write whatever feels right for the book, and you should not, be policed by one sort of mindset or another, and if you don't like one or the other, then you are not forced to read it. I feel very strongly about that you should be able to write what you feel comfortable with writing, and the people that who are meant to read your books will find your books. And the people who don't like how you write or what you share on the page with the characters, then they don't have to read it. You know what I mean? That's the great thing about publishing is there's a book for everyone. And so I just am not a fan of sort of policing the heat levels in books is how I'll say it.
Well, this wasn't, I mean, the funny thing is there's reader groups that are called smut talk or smut books. And the only thing I found interesting was, because yes, I read books in the 80s. That's where I started reading. And you didn't have to describe the package. You didn't have to describe his member. And now women want to know exactly length, girth, everything. And it's like, okay, but don't you want that to your imagination?
Again, I think it's super up to whatever your interest in reading is. You know what I mean? Because I feel like, the breadth and course of the romance genre is massive. You know what I mean? Because not only do you have the traditional contemporary, but now, paranormal is huge, and, romantasy is a thing now, and so there's all these different ways that you can sort of take on and enjoy whatever is within what I like to call your heat level, you know? And so some people like high heat, some like people like low heat, some people like no heat, you know, type of thing. So that's what I really like about like being introduced and being part of the romance community now is I feel like there's something for every reader. And that's great. And whatever works for you is, you know, is totally up to you and what your choice is. Because, you know, sometimes I read books and, you know, romance books and they're great. And then sometimes they're not for me. And I think that's just publishing as a whole is just very subjective. And, you know, and I think people lean into whatever their comfort levels are.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I mean, I meant no offense. I wasn't.
No, it's not that. It's just that, you know, I'm still learning about like being a member of the romance community because being a part of the historical community, totally different, you know what I mean? But being a part of the romance community, it's really opened my eyes to being, you know, part of this community and knowing, you know, what people like and what people love. And, you know, there's like there's a whole part of the community that loves like, you know, vampire romance and shifter romance and all this kind of stuff, you know, and then there's people who are totally love the contemporary stuff. So again, I just like that there's something for everyone in this community, you know, and I like how like people are open to being okay with whatever you like, you know. So if you like it hot, you like it hot. If you like it not steamy, then it's not steamy.
This is true. So yeah. Is there anything that we did not talk about that you want to add?
I don't think so. We've had such a great conversation. The only thing I would probably add is that Meet Me in Ivy Falls comes out US paperback June 25th. And then it comes out in the UK and in ebook on July 4th. And it's the first book in a series. So the Ivy Falls series. So this first book, again, is called Meet Me in Ivy Falls. And then book 2 comes out in November of this year. And then the third book will follow in probably early summer next year. So it's very cool. I always used to write standalones. It's been an incredible experience writing a series. Hard, very hard. But fun to write a series. So I'm just hoping that people will check it out and fall in love with the first book and then come back for the second and the third book in the series.
Have you finished the series already and you're just waiting to publish
I'm actually in copy edits for book 2, and I just the other day started writing the synopsis for book 3. So I actually, in order to sell the books, I had to write a synopsis, like a massive synopsis for each book in the series, so that the publisher knew that like I sort of knew where this story was going. So I sort of already have sort of like a course map sort of set out, you know. It's just a matter of like, you know, taking the pieces and parts and getting it together. But yes, book 2 is is totally done. I'm in copy edits now, and then book 3 I'll be working on this summer.
Is there a cliffhanger in book 1?
There's not.
Okay. I just have to ask.
There's not. It's more of like a companion book series. Okay. So you're gonna meet all the characters in book 1, and then couples from like the book will follow in the books to follow. So like book 2 follows, you know, a couple that you meet in book 1, and then of course book 3 is a couple of one character that you know from book 2 that she will have like a romance in book 3. So I have this thing where like I write minor characters that I really fall in love with that like to take over the page. And then they go from being minor characters to me going, I think this person deserves a whole book. So that's kind of where I'm at now, where I sort of fall in love with characters and then I want to sort of give them their happily ever after. So that's where we're at right now. So yeah, it'll follow like the trajectory of all these characters through the series of books. So a lot like, I don't know if you've ever seen like the story Sweet Magnolia, the TV show Sweet Magnolias. There's also Virgin River on Netflix, kind of that feel where like you meet the characters and then you got to kind of get to see their lives as it changes. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. Well, I thank you, Amy, for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
So Amy and I had a very interesting conversation about historical fiction and writing in general. And I think that when you're writing, you have to look at certain parameters to see, is this book going to work? Am I going to connect with my readers? Am I going to make them feel emotion? And does this little bit here matter? Because we do a lot of research. When we're writing historical fiction, we do a lot of research because we want to make sure we get those things right. We want to make sure that if somebody is reading it, that maybe was around back then, or that at least knows the history, that they understand where we're coming from. And I think it's important that we do the research. As a writer, there's a lot of research. And I'm not sure that everybody really realizes how much research can go into a book, because after all, it's fiction and we're creating a world. But when that world is based in reality, it's a little bit different. I mean, sure, when you're writing certain fiction, you can create a world with dragons and castles. But when you're writing real stuff, you got to kind of look around. And as she did, she added something in that didn't exist, even though it was set in a real time. But the whole fact of the matter is, she had to create it because it had to be part of the story. So, for all the people that want to write, you can do it if it's your passion, if it makes you happy and brings joy to you. Tell your story. And the funny thing is, I have been told by people that, oh, well, I can't do this because I can't get published. You can get published. You can publish yourself. And, I'm not you can query if you want, you can get an agent. And like she said, it's hard. But just because you're doing all that stuff doesn't mean you can't publish stuff and put stuff out and work on your craft. It doesn't mean you can't learn and build your following. It doesn't mean that you have to be stopped. So follow your dream, follow your passion. Same thing goes with music, art, whatever you want to do. If you're creative and this feels good to you, then embrace your passion. Because like she said, Amy and I both enjoy talking about writing. And it's a gift when you can do that. It's an important gift to be able to tell your story, even if it's somebody else that you're writing about. So, on that note, I hope you enjoyed the show as always. I'd like to thank Rich Zai of Third Ear Audio for doing the sound and audio. I'd like to thank Fast Susie for the intro and outro music. And I'd like to thank you, the viewer or the listener, for tuning in, because this is the reason why I do this, because I want to share stories or other people's stories with you so you can learn something and maybe have an experience or inspiration from something. And hopefully Amy's story did that. So thank you for listening. And I hope whenever you listen, whether it be night, evening, day, whenever, you enjoy it and you have a great day. So take care, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.